My name is Harper, and I have a really strange story. Before we begin, I'd like to ask if any of you have ever felt like the odd one out in your family. Maybe everyone else enjoys football and you despise it. Perhaps they all have dark hair and you have blonde. So if you know what that's like, double it by a million, and that's how I feel in my family. Listen to me out and you'll understand why. I was born into a rather ordinary family. As normal as a person can be. My parents were teachers and my older sisters were as irritating and obnoxious as everyone else's. We all loved each other, spent time together, and had wonderful lives. My cousin Grace was the only family member with whom I did not get along. I imagine she was jealous of me because she wished she had sisters because she was an only child, and she envied the fact that I had two while she had none. Aside from Grace, I assumed our lives would always be great and full of happiness, but I was mistaken. My father died unexpectedly of a heart attack when I was 13, and we were all distraught. We had no idea how we would continue on with our lives after losing such a large part of our existence. My mother became stuck in a rut. She no longer went to work. She had ceased caring for herself. She had pretty well ceased doing whatever had previously mattered to her. We couldn't get her interested in anything, no matter what my elder sisters did. Not until my older sister turned on the E! Channel and stopped keeping up with the Kardashians, my mother became obsessed almost immediately. Over the next 3 weeks, she binge-watched the entire episode in her pajamas on the couch. It was as if we had reclaimed our mother after that. She began bathing and clothing herself again. She even walked out of the house. I was overjoyed. Even though losing my father was something we'd never get over, our family looked full again. Not quite, but something more malevolent lurked beneath the surface. I just didn't realize it yet. My mother quit waking up for work in the morning a year later. I feared the worst and that she would relapse into depression, but the truth was far more difficult to accept. I walked into her room one morning and found her sleeping. I shook her and attempted to rouse her awake, but all she did was grumble and roll over. It just wasn't working. I needed to try something new. Finally, I turned on a light and removed the comforter from her. I informed her that she needed to get out of bed for work and that lying in bed wouldn't help her. But Mom said she didn't have to work that day. I was perplexed. She worked as a teacher. In an hour, school would begin. It just didn't make sense. When I asked her about it, her response stunned me. Mom told me she'd obtained another job in the evenings instead, but I didn't get it. My mother had been a teacher my entire life. She'd never even mentioned being unhappy or wanting to change occupations. It was quite bizarre. When I asked her what she was doing presently, she said she was entertaining at I wasn't sure what she meant. Nothing made sense, but I figured if my mother was pleased, I was happy. Unfortunately, things got 10 times worse. My mother began to dress differently and began to spend far too much money on luxury clothing. I looked at my mother's credit card invoices and discovered she was in a lot of debt. I didn't want it to go on, but I was just 14 and didn't know where to begin. I expected my mother to take care of me, not the other way around. My mother told me the oddest story a few weeks later. She came into the kitchen while I was doing my homework at the dinner table. She informed me that she would be undergoing surgery shortly and that my elder sisters would be caring for me while she was in the hospital. I was quite terrified. My father had already died, and I didn't want to lose my mother as well. My eyes welled up with tears, and I reached out to hold her hand in mine. "What's the problem?" I inquired about her. She shook her head and laughed. "There's nothing wrong with me, Umoran. It's just some cosmetic surgery." She said this with a smile. It was impossible for me to believe. My jaw opened wide, and I looked at her as if she were insane. She was already deeply in debt. How would she pay for plastic surgery? And, more crucially, why did I have so many unanswered questions? When I asked her about it, she said it was for work, but I didn't understand what kind of profession required you to change your appearance. I asked my sisters, and they advised me to leave. All that mattered was that Mom was content. You may believe that things can't get any worse, but you'd be wrong. I eventually discovered that my mother's new work was an imposter. She was posing as Kris Jenner at a nightclub. It was completely insane. It had to be a joke, didn't it? When I challenged my sisters about it, they admitted that they had been collaborating with my mother all along. They were impersonating Kim and Khloe Kardashian. I mean, I guess my family resembled though we had the same brown skin and black hair. Like the sisters in that renowned family, my sisters and I were slender but curvaceous. but mimicking them seemed like going too far. Who wants to spend their entire life trying to be someone else? Now that the cat was out of the bag, I tried to persuade them that they might make better use of their time. But they were all sure that they were content with their lives as they were. It didn't make sense to me, but I was glad they were happy and that my mother found something to do with her time other than greed. However, my mother's debts did not seem to improve over time. Her job didn't pay enough to cover the costs of maintaining her beauty. She kept getting Botox and plastic surgery. She was dyeing her hair and buying luxury clothes to look as similar to Avery as possible. My sisters were not much better. They were all preoccupied with gaining likes and followers on Instagram. I just didn't understand the sense of it all. By the time I was 16, all three of them were still going strong. Except they began doing more performances, creating films, and even selling merchandise. They all had millions of Instagram followers before I realized it. It was a nightmare, and to make matters worse, they became the laughingstock of my entire town. Everyone at school started calling us the Kardashians. People often asked me which one I was supposed to be, making me the punchline to every joke. I despised it. When I first started high school, it was tough for me to establish friends. And the other students made every day at school a living nightmare. But did my family give a damn? They didn't, of course. They were far too preoccupied with their own happiness to care about me, especially since they were making ridiculous amounts of money from it. Instead, I had to cope with my problems on my own. I cried myself to sleep virtually every night about how much I despised it. I wish I had come from a different family. I desperately wanted to leave, but I didn't know how. Then things started to go downhill. My sisters and mother began to persuade me that I was old enough for surgery as well. They claimed they could do my brows and makeup to make me appear like Kylie Jenner. I was furious. How could they not grasp what I was saying? They still assumed I'd play their ridiculous games after all this time. They went on and on, trying to persuade me to join them. I even gave up once. I was depressed and believed spending time with my sisters would make me feel better. I was mistaken. They did my makeup and applied fake tan to me. I despised myself when I finally glanced in the mirror. I didn't resemble myself at all. I didn't understand why they were so desperate to transform me. Wasn't I fine simply being myself? I put down my foot and said no. I told them I didn't want to be a part of their ridiculous shows and that I wanted to live my own life. My mother was furious when she found out. They all came up to me and confronted me. My mother informed me that I was being silly by not supporting their efforts. She advised me to do what was best for the family as a whole. She said that if I didn't do what she wanted, she'd summon my cousin Grace to take my place. My cousin, who had always been envious of me and would go to any length to get into my family, it was the final straw. I was tired of always being the polite one while my family wrecked my life. All I could think of was myself. When have they ever stood with me? When was the last time they did what was best for me? I could feel myself becoming increasingly enraged. I pounded my feet on the floor and yelled at my mother. I stated that they had never treated me with love or considered how this whole situation affected me. They all looked at me as if I were nuts. However, before anyone could say anything, I turned and rushed up to my room. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I sobbed into my pillow. My life had been a farce. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't stand a chance of having a happy, regular life while living with these Kardashian-obsessed women. That's when I realized I'd found the answer to all of my troubles. If I could find a way to escape my house, I could be free of my family and live my life the way I wanted. But how was I going to accomplish that? I didn't have any friends to stay with, and the only other family I had were my uncle and aunt, Grace's parents. I believe living with Grace would have been even more difficult. So I took a long breath and gathered my thoughts. How was I going to get myself out of this mess? Then it struck me. What if I simply ran away? I may look for a homeless shelter or even a church that could assist me. Anything was preferable to remaining in this house for another moment. When I made the decision, I packed my belongings, climbed out of my bedroom window and ran. It wasn't all rainbows and sunshine though. For starters, I had no idea how cold it was outside. November was perhaps not the ideal time of year to flee, but it was already too late. I went to the next town over, but I couldn't locate a place to stay there. Then I tried the next town and the one after that and the one after that. I eventually started feeling ill. The rain and freezing weather made everything worse. When the sun had already set and a storm was gathering, I sought refuge in a park beneath a grove of trees. Because I couldn't sleep due to my cough, I stayed awake, counting the leaves above me, until I finally passed out. The next thing I knew, I was awake with physicians all around me. I was wearing an oxygen mask over my mouth, and the lights were brilliant and harsh. I wanted to know where I was, but I couldn't do it. I was too feeble. Then it all went black. When I awoke the next morning, I noticed a familiar face. It was my mother, and she looked terrible. She wept, wrecking her makeup, and appeared sleep-deprived for days. I extended my hand and touched her hand. Her entire face lit up, and she grinned at me. She expressed her delight at seeing me awake, saying she had feared she would never see me again. I gave her a kind grin. I couldn't speak because I was so weak. She expressed her regret. She realized she'd gone too far with her fascination with the Kardashians. She admitted that it was her way of coping when my father died. She explained that if she pretended to be someone else, she wouldn't have to face the reality of living without him. She shook her head and wiped tears from her eyes, attempting to be exactly like Kris Jenner, who had given her motivation and a purpose to continue. But you should have motivated me. My children should have been my motivation to keep going. Instead, I've completely forgotten about you. How are you going to forgive me? She stated. She began sobbing at that point. She sobbed and wrapped her arms around my body, tightly squeezing me. I stroked her hair and hugged her, and I smiled, knowing that things would change after that. They succeeded. My mother and I decided to spend every evening together. We shared meals, watched soap operas, and my mother even allowed me to adopt a dog. I chose a sweet Labrador dog. My mother joked that we should call her Kim. I've never stared at someone so intently before, and I never called her Kim, Chloe, or Kendall. Hope was her name, and she has been just that for me. People at school continued to pick on me about my family, so I transferred and started again. My life returned to normalcy after becoming a nightmare. And while I cringe at all the years we squandered, it is nice to have my mother back as herself.